Hello, and welcome to the first of several prototype reference videos hosted on this YouTube channel. Most of these will focus on topics relating to the Pacific Great Eastern British Columbia Railway, but this first one is applicable to freight cars in general. If you would like to know what all that stenciling on our freight cars means, or if you want to know how to letter a freight car accurately, this video is for you. The paint and stenciling on our freight cars can do much to convey the era and locale we are modeling. Painting and decaling freight cars is a key component of prototype railway modeling. Let's look at two photographs taken 30 years apart. The first image was taken in Chicago during 1943. We see what are predominantly drab colors and simple stencil schemes. The lower photograph was taken in North Vancouver in the early 1970s. While there are still older cars in drab colors, there are also newer cars in brighter colors with more complex stencil schemes, including corporate logograms. Before going too much further, we should get ourselves oriented with respect to the anatomy of a freight car. The ends are designated as the A end and the B end based on the location of the brake wheel or brake lever, which is at the B end. This in turn determines the designation of the left and right sides of the car. Some stenciling is seen only on one side of the car. The four corners are designated as AL, AR, BL, and BR. This nomenclature is typically seen on bad order or defect cards to identify safety fittings or other equipment in need of repair. The information stenciled on the ends and sides of a freight car provide railway employees, shippers, and others with essential information concerning the car's ownership, history, capabilities, clearance limits, and the state of its regular servicing. The style, size, spacing, and placement of all essential stenciling is governed by standards which are mandated by the Association of American Railroads. There are also specific regulations in Canada for certain markings, such as reflectors. Depending on the era, the essential stenciling can include the following items: reporting marks, draft gear and wheel information, AAR mechanical designation, capacity data, dimensional data, plate clearance, instructions for doors, gates, and brakes, a build or rebuild date, and the servicing history, such as a lube plate or a consolidated stencil. We will look at each of these in detail a little later on, but for now, let's look at a few examples from different eras and then look into each of these items. During the 1920s and 1930s, most railway car stenciling was fairly simple in its layout. This CN car was built in 1930 and displays a stenciling arrangement typical of the era. The data is arranged in two blocks, and the railway's name is simply spelled out. Note the absence of a corporate herald. By the 1940s and 1950s, railways were beginning to decorate their cars with corporate heralds and slogans. This CP Boxcar was built in 1947, and it displays a typical stenciling arrangement from the period. The CP spans the World Herald, advertised CP's worldwide transportation system. By the 1960s and 1970s, railways began to adopt brighter colors for their rolling stock and often applied large corporate logograms. This steel boxcar was repainted in 1977, and it displays a typical scheme of the era with a bright color, a large corporate logogram, and other markings. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, railways began to revert to simpler schemes as stenciling requirements were relaxed, budgets were tightened, and many cars were obtained on lease. This boxcar was built in 1999 and displays a simplified stencil arrangement. Note the absence of a corporate logogram. This is a leased car. We'll now look at each item of stenciling in greater detail. For the end stenciling, we see the reporting marks, which were stenciled in 4-inch high letters and numerals on each end of the car in the top right-hand corner. This was required for boxcars, refrigerator cars, gondolas, and hopper cars. On tank cars, the end reporting marks were typically centered. Other stenciling seen on the ends of cars could include information about the springs, wheels, or draft gear. The side reporting marks were stenciled in 7-inch or 9-inch high letters and numerals on both sides of boxcars, refrigerator cars, gondolas, and hopper cars. For flat cars and tank cars, the letters and numerals were 7 inches high, and there were some requirements with regards to how high they were located above the left truck. The AAR mechanical designation was displayed immediately to the left of the capacity data. These were introduced in 1910, and they were listed in the official railway equipment register. The car in this photograph has an AAR mechanical designation of XM, which denotes a boxcar for general service. The capacity, load limit, and lightweight figures were shown in 3-inch high letters and numerals centered below the reporting marks. This information was important for shippers when loading cars, as these figures were not to be exceeded. Following the lightweight is the month and year in which the car was built, and the station and the date of the last weighing. The car seen below was weighed in North Vancouver during November 1977. It was originally built in May of 1967. Capacity denotes the designed load-carrying capacity of the car, rounded to the nearest 1,000 pounds. This was determined by the structural strength of the car's underframe and the size of the car's journal bearings. It's interesting to note that this figure was later realized to be redundant with the load limit and was removed from the stenciling requirements in 1985. This line often ended up being painted out after that. Load limit indicates the maximum weight of lading that can be carried by the car, rounded to the nearest 100 pounds. This was determined by subtracting the weight of the car when empty from the total allowable gross weight given the size of the car's journal bearings. Lightweight specifies the weight of the car when empty, rounded to the nearest 100 pounds. Built states the month and year in which the car was originally built. A 2-letter code and date state the location and date when the car was last reweighed. If we see new and a date, that indicates that the weight shown was as built and had yet to be checked since construction. The dimensional figures were shown in 2-inch or 3-inch high letters and numerals, also centered below the reporting marks. This information was important for railway employees and shippers, where restricted clearances were encountered. Related to the dimensional data is the Aar Plate Designation, which was to be located to the right of the side reporting marks. Cars conforming to Plate B did not require a marking. Cars conforming to Plate C, E, or F displayed this in a 10-inch square. EXW and EXH are the extreme width and height above the rail at which that width occurs. These are shown when the height of a car's eaves exceeds 12 foot. Cars over 15 foot 6 inches in height will also show extreme height and the width at that height. The eaves width and the eaves height show the width and height at the eaves which extend over the sides of the car. The interior dimensions, the interior length, width, and height are all shown in feet and inches, and the cubic feet shows the inside volume of the car based on those interior dimensions. The plate C, E, or F markings indicate whether a car's extreme outside dimensions are within a standard cross-section, either plate B, C, E, or F. If a car's dimensions are within plate B, which is the smallest, no marking is shown. Cars with dimensions exceeding a given plate will display exceeds plate C, E, or F. Here we see a photograph of a boxcar in 1973 displaying some additional stenciling which might be seen on a car. This includes the lease arrangements in the top left-hand corner, L for left side next to the doors, and 25K for the floor lading, also next to the doors, retaining valve and an arrow pointing to the underside of the car, and a yellow caution no running board stencil block in the lower right-hand corner. It's interesting to note that the retaining valve and the yellow caution no roof stencil block would only appear on this side of the car. Lube plate is a general term referring to the area where a car's service history has been recorded. Prior to 1974, the servicing history of the car was typically recorded in 1-inch letters and numerals above or near the right bolster. When replacing this information, the older information was to be painted out with the car color or with black. We might see several abbreviations in this area. COTS stood for Clean, Oil, Test and Stencil of the Brake System. RPKD stood for Repacking of the Journals on Solid Bearing Trucks. LUB stood for Lubrication of Roller Bearing Trucks. IDT was an in-date test for the brakes, and INSP was a simple inspection. In July of 1974, the AAR mandated the application of consolidated stencils to record the service history of the car. The service history was to be recorded in 1-inch letters and numerals on a black background with a 1-inch white border. And again, we would see various abbreviations on those panels. Now, this change came about because by this time railways were using different colors for their freight cars, and it was more difficult to match that color. So it was easier simply to paint over a black panel with black and then record the information in white. The consolidated stencils had a size requirement, and the service information was to be updated whenever periodic lubrication was performed. It was to be recorded in 1-inch high white letters and numerals on the black background with a 1-inch white border. These consolidated stencils appeared in several different styles over the years. On the left, we see an early single panel style. In the middle, we see a 2-panel style. These could either be arranged horizontally or vertically. And on the right, we see a later 3-panel style. Tank cars had different requirements for stenciling, including the latest test of tank safety fittings. In the late 1990s, a new consolidated stencil for tank cars with data in a table was mandated. On the left, we see a tank car with the older layout above the right truck. On the right, we see another tank car which has the older consolidated stencil, but also the newer table above the right truck. The AAR requirement for consolidated stencils was discontinued in 2016, and new cars or repainted freight cars have since appeared without them. In 1966, railways were permitted to remove running boards from freight cars, and from 1966 new freight cars were built without them. Running boards and high brake wheels were to be removed from freight cars by 1974, but they lasted into the 1980s. They were prohibited in 1983. When running boards were removed, the brake wheels were typically lowered, a crossover platform was provided on the end of the car, and ladders were lowered or replaced with grab irons. However, railways sometimes did not cut down the ladders or lower the brake wheel, as seen in this example here. A keep-off roof no running board stencil with black letters on a yellow background has been applied at the BL corner on the car, which retains the high ladders. Similar stencil blocks are used for cars without roofs, such as woodchip cars, in which case the stencil block would read, "Caution, no roof." On a lot of cars, we saw wheel inspection symbols, and these are traced to a series of derailments in the 1970s, and the cause was found to have been a defective lot of wheels. The Federal Railroad Administration instituted a regulation in March of 1978 requiring the inspection of all 70-ton freight cars with 33-inch wheels. Cars which had defective wheels received a 6-inch white dot on a 12-inch black square, while cars with approved wheels received a 6-inch yellow dot on a 12-inch black square. These stencils could be seen on freight cars for several years afterwards. The CarTrack automatic car identification system was introduced in 1967, and it was mandated for plates to be applied to all freight cars by 1970. These plates contained a barcode which was scanned at trackside to record a car's location. The system eventually failed due to declining readability over time, and it was abandoned in 1978, but some cars retained their ACI plates for years afterwards. These plates measured 10 inches wide by 22 inches high, and they comprised 13 colored bands, which could be red, blue, black, or black and white. On some cars, such as flat cars, the car side might be less than 22 inches high, in which case the ACI label was mounted on a plate. This arrangement could also be seen on the side sills of locomotives. In 1974, a Canadian regulation required the application of reflectors to all new freight cars. These were to be applied along both sides of the car above each bolster and also spaced equally in between. Cars with a length of 56 feet or less had 4 reflectors, while cars exceeding that length required 6. The reflectors were either 4-inch circles or diamonds, cut from 3M Scotch-Lite reflective sheet. On the left, we see a hopper car with 4 round reflectors, and on the left, we see a woodchip car with 6 diamond-shaped reflectors. In 2004, a new requirement for reflective markings on freight cars in Canada and the United States was announced. A series of vertical yellow reflective conspicuity stripes were to be applied along both sides of the car. This requirement applied to all freight cars with a deadline of 2013 for Canada and 2015 for the United States, with renewal every 10 years. On freight cars which had not been repainted since construction, we would see a builder's logo somewhere. The major car builders in Canada typically applied their logograms above or near the left bolster on each side of the car. These logograms evolved over time in design and application, evolving from fairly simple white stencils to multicolored decals. And here we see some examples from the major Canadian builders, including Hawker Siddeley, Marine Industries, and National Steel Car. And of course, the railway would always display its name on the car somewhere. During the 1920s and 1930s, most railway cars were painted red or black, and their stencil schemes were usually all white, with the railway name simply spelled out in a plain standard typeface. No stylization or herald, usually. Here we see some examples of cars in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s that show that. In the 1940s and 1950s, we began to see corporate logograms, usually still all white, and also we would see slogans, sometimes in a stylized script. And in the 1960s and 1970s, railways began to paint their freight cars in different colors, and corporate logograms became more colorful and stylized. Some of these logograms achieved a high level of public recognition, and some retain that status today. A search of Canadian corporate logograms quickly turns up the CN Noodle or the CP Multimark. The CN Noodle is one of Canada's most recognized corporate logograms, and it has been in use since 1960. CP's Multimark logogram was first unveiled in 1968, and it was seen on CP ships, trains, and trucks. The 1960s and 70s were also an era in which we saw a proliferation of colorful schemes applied to private owner cars. These included lumber companies, mineral companies, and leasing companies. Here are a few examples of private owner cars in fairly colorful schemes. In the 1980s and 1990s, railways began to simplify or omit corporate logograms, and they moved towards simpler stencil schemes. This was driven by cost, tighter budgets, and also a move towards large fleets of leased cars. The explosion of expansive graffiti on freight cars also played a role. On the left, we see a car with a CN noodle, but it is now smaller, and it also incorporates the URL for the company's website. And on the right, we see a leased car with no logogram. So now I'll talk a little bit about some modeling aspects of this. Accurate stenciling, as I mentioned, is a key component of successful railway prototype modeling, and certain aspects of a paint and stencil scheme can help to define an era and location we are modeling. Some research is needed to determine which paint and stencil schemes were in use at the time you wish to model. The in-service dates for most railway logograms is well known. For example, the CN noodle appeared in 1960, the CP Multimark was unveiled in 1968, and the British Columbia Railway Dogwood logogram was adopted with the railway's change of name in 1972. The application of consolidated stencils was required by 1974, and their evolving layouts can help to provide subtle reinforcement of a particular era. The application of reflectors also dates from 1974. Initially, this was a Canadian-only requirement. The presence of yellow conspicuity stripes clearly dates a freight car or a photograph of one to 2004 or later. Several companies offer model railway decals. Some of them offer them in different scales, and some of them specialize in various types of decals and in various road names. Microscale also offers some decal sets specializing in accessory items such as ACI plates, consolidated stencils, the wheel inspection symbols, conspicuity stripes, and more. And here are a few examples of some of those sets. The best references for freight car stenciling are the original paint and stencil diagrams if you can obtain them. These diagrams were prepared by the builder prior to construction, and they were sent to the railway or the private owner for approval. The diagrams provide specific details as to the arrangement, placement, and size of all stenciling decals and logograms. Here on the left we see a paint and stencil diagram for a Procore rotary gondola built in 1975, and on the right hand side we see the actual car. Photographs are also a valuable reference as they show what was actually applied, where and how. Photographs of earlier cars with intact original stenciling can be hard to find. Builders' photographs are the best resource if you can obtain them, as the cars are clean and the lettering is easily read. Most common railway and private owner logograms are available from commercial decal suppliers. These corporate logograms were usually commissioned from graphic designers, and once adopted were to be applied according to very specific guidelines. If you can obtain the railway's drawing for a particular logogram and the guidelines for appearance and application, these are valuable references. Here we see a company diagram for the British Columbia Railway Dogwood logogram dated February of 1972 when it was adopted. Let's now look at the process of getting from a reference photograph to a model with decals on it. A study of prototype photographs and acquisition or preparation of suitable decals can lead to completion of a highly accurate model. In the upper left photograph, we see a car that has been rebuilt and painted by the U.S. Railway Equipment Company for the British Columbia Railway in 1973. And the lower photograph shows two N-scale models completed with custom paint and decals using the above photograph as a reference. To look at this process in a little more detail, here is a series of photographs taken during the process of getting decals on a scratch-built model of a trailer flat car, which was built in December of 1961 by Canadian Car and Foundry. In the upper left photograph, you see a copy of the railway stencil diagram for these cars, which I was fortunate to obtain, and several reference photographs of the cars in their original scheme. At right is an initial layout of the required stenciling on the computer, and in the lower left corner we see the completed decal sheet printed by Precision Design, and in the lower right hand corner I'm applying those custom decals to a painted and gloss coated model of the trailer flat car. I would like to thank the following individuals whose photographs appeared in this presentation with permission: and I would like to thank you for visiting and watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it and that it might assist you in creating more accurate freight car models. If you have, I invite you to like and subscribe to this channel. I hope to upload prototype videos on model railway topics in the near future. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.